The last of the coffee ground swirled into the tin mug, leaving a bitter dust that promised little warmth. Jedediah Stone stared into the near-empty supply crate, the scraping sound of the scoop against metal a grim echo in the small cabin. Outside, the wind howled a hymn of pure, white fury. It was the third day of the blizzard, a monster that had swallowed the Montana landscape whole, erasing the mountains, the pines, and the very idea of a world beyond his four walls. He had come to this place for solitude, to be ground down to the essential parts of a man: hunger, cold, and silence. But the silence he'd found was a hungry thing, and his supplies were dwindling faster than the winter. Therefore, he had no choice but to check the trap lines. It was a fool's errand in a whiteout, a task that risked getting turned around and freezing to death 100 yards from his own door. He pulled on his heavy coat, the wool stiff and smelling of wood smoke and wet animal hide. He wrapped a scarf over the lower half of his face, the cold already a physical blow the moment he cracked open the door. The world was a churning vortex of snow. He tied one end of a rope to the door latch and the other around his waist, a lifeline in the blinding chaos. He could only see a few feet ahead, the familiar shapes of the trees warped into ghostly apparitions. He followed the line of pines that marked the path to his traps, his boots sinking deep with every step. It was at the third snare, a loop of wire now buried under a drift, that he saw it. A patch of color. A smudge of light brown against the overwhelming white. It wasn't the russet of a fox or the gray of a rabbit. It was the color of worn cloth. He moved closer, his heart a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. It was a person, half buried in a snowdrift, a small shape curled against the base of a pine tree. Then he saw another figure, huddled over the first, trying to shield the still body with their own. As he approached, the second figure looked up. It was a young woman, her face pale with cold, her dark hair laced with snow. Her eyes, wide and terrified, fixed on him. She was Chinese, and the one she was protecting looked to be her identical twin. Both were clad in simple, tattered prairie dresses, wholly inadequate for the brutal cold. They were no older than 18. The one on the ground was terrifyingly still, but the other one, seeing him, began to push herself to her feet. She stumbled, her movements clumsy with cold, and held her hands up in a gesture of pleading. "Please," she whispered, the word a plume of frozen breath. "Help! Sister!" Jedediah knelt, pushing aside the snow from the other girl's face. Her skin had a bluish tint, her lips were pale. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck. The pulse was there, a faint, thready flutter, as fragile as a trapped bird's wing. He looked from the unconscious girl to her desperate sister. Bringing them back to his cabin was an act of madness. His food was measured in days, not weeks. Firewood was plentiful, but 2 more mouths, 2 more bodies needing warmth, would tax his resources to their breaking point. Trouble followed people, and he had come here to be quit of it. But the girl standing before him was shivering violently, her eyes locked on his, a raw and silent scream for mercy. He saw the flicker of hope in them, a tiny flame in the heart of the blizzard, and knew he couldn't extinguish it. He had spent years hardening his heart, building a wall of isolation around himself, yet here, in the heart of a storm, that wall crumbled. He couldn't leave them. To do so would be a kind of death for him, too. Without a word, he scooped the unconscious girl into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of cold limbs and damp cloth. He grunted with the effort, his own body already feeling the strain of the cold. He turned back toward the faint outline of his cabin, a sanctuary that now felt impossibly far. "Come on," he said, his voice rough. The other girl nodded, her face streaked with frozen tears. She followed close behind him, her hand sometimes reaching out as if to touch her sister, a phantom gesture of comfort in the roaring wind. Jedediah focused on the rope, his guide back to shelter. Each step was a battle against the wind and the deepening snow, the dead weight in his arms a constant, chilling reminder of the life he now held in his hands. He didn't know their names, or how they had come to be in the middle of nowhere during the worst blizzard of the season. He only knew that the solitude he had so carefully cultivated was over. The storm had brought the world back to his door, and he had just carried it inside. He laid the girl on his own cot, the only soft place in the one-room cabin. Her sister hovered nearby, her hands clasped tightly together. Jedediah worked quickly, his movements economical and sure. He piled more logs onto the fire, the flames roaring up the stone chimney, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He stripped the girl's wet, frozen dress from her body, his motions impersonal, and wrapped her in his driest wool blankets. Her sister watched every move, her fear warring with a desperate hope. "I am my," she said, her voice still trembling. She pointed to the girl on the cot. "She isn't." "Jedediah," he replied, not looking up from his task. He was rubbing Anne's feet, trying to force circulation back into the frozen extremities. They were like blocks of ice. He could see the dark patches of frostbite already forming on her toes. Mai knelt beside him, her English halting but clear. "Thank you. We lost. From railroad camp." Railroad camp. That explained something. The Northern Pacific was laying track 30 miles to the south. But 30 miles was a lifetime in this weather. To have fled from there, they must have been desperate. For the next 2 days, the blizzard raged, sealing them inside the cabin. Anne's condition worsened. The initial chill gave way to a violent fever. She shivered and thrashed in his cot, muttering in a language he didn't understand. Jedediah did what little he could. He spooned broth, thinned from his meager supply of salted meat, between her cracked lips. He kept a cool, damp cloth on her forehead. Mai never left her side, speaking to her in soft, soothing tones, her presence a constant, silent vigil. Jedediah watched them, a strange feeling tightening his chest. He saw the fierce, unyielding bond between the two sisters. He saw the way Mai would instinctively reach out and smooth Anne's hair, or the way her own body would tense whenever Anne cried out in her delirium. In their shared silence, a fragile trust began to form. He would offer Mai a cup of weak coffee, and she would accept it with a small, grateful nod. He would add another log to the fire, and she would watch him, her dark eyes filled with an unreadable expression. He was a stranger, a rough-looking man in a remote cabin, yet they were utterly at his mercy, and she seemed to understand he meant them no harm. On the 4th morning, the wind finally died. A weak, watery sunlight filtered through the single grime-streaked window, illuminating a world transformed, buried under a thick blanket of pristine snow. The silence was profound. But it was a temporary peace. Anne's fever had not broken, and Jedediah knew he needed more than broth and blankets. He needed medicine. He needed quinine from the general store in Granite Creek. The settlement was a 10-mile trek, a full day's journey in the deep snow. Leaving the sisters alone was a risk, but staying was a greater one. He explained his plan to Mai using simple words and gestures. Town. Medicine. Fern. He took his rifle down from the wall pegs. He didn't offer to teach her its use, but he laid it on the small table by the door. "Bar the door," he said, pointing to the heavy wooden beam. "Don't open it. For anyone." Mai looked from the rifle to his face. She understood the unspoken warning. The wilderness held more dangers than just the cold. She gave a firm, single nod. Her fear was still there, but it was now overlaid with a grim resolve. The journey to Granite Creek was arduous. The snow was waist-deep in places, and he had to break a new trail. By the time he saw the plumes of smoke rising from the town's chimneys, the sun was low in the sky, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. The town was little more than a single muddy street lined with a dozen clapboard buildings, a saloon, a livery, a blacksmith, and the general store that served as the town's heart. The store was warm, smelling of coffee, cured leather, and damp wool. A few men were gathered around the pot-bellied stove, their voices low. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, gave Jedediah a curt nod from behind the counter. Jedediah rarely came to town, and when he did, he bought flour, salt, and ammunition, and left. He was a known quantity, a man who kept to himself, which in a place like Granite Creek, was a respectable, if not friendly, trait. "Jedediah," Henderson said. "Figured the storm kept you holed up." It did, Jedediah said, handing over his list. It was short: quinine, a sack of flour, coffee, and a bolt of wool flannel. It was the flannel and the quinine that earned him a second look from Henderson. As Henderson gathered the items, the door swung open, letting in a blast of cold air. A big man with a florid face and a heavy buffalo coat strode in, followed by two rough-looking men. Jedediah recognized him immediately: Barrett, the foreman for the railroad work crew. He was known for his temper and his heavy hand. Barrett paid Jedediah no mind, stomping the snow from his boots and heading straight for the stove. "Whiskey, Henderson," he boomed, his voice filling the small store. "And leave the bottle. Damn storm cost me 3 days' work and 2 laundry girls." One of the men by the stove spoke up. "Run off, did they? In that blizzard?" "More like froze to death in a ditch somewhere," Barrett grumbled, pouring a generous measure of whiskey into a cup. "Pair of Chinese sisters. Identical. Can't tell them apart. More trouble than they're worth, but I paid good money for their contracts." He took a long swallow of whiskey. "Still, it's the principle of the thing. They run, others get ideas." Jedediah felt the eyes of the men in the store shift to him. He kept his face impassive, his gaze fixed on the counter as Henderson wrapped his supplies. He could feel the weight of their speculation. A man who lives alone, suddenly buying medicine and women's cloth, right after the foreman reports 2 missing girls. It was a simple, damning arithmetic. Barrett seemed to notice the quiet shift in the room. He turned, his eyes narrowing as they fell on Jedediah. He walked over to the counter, his steps heavy and deliberate. "Stone," he said, his voice laced with a false cordiality. "Didn't expect to see you down from your mountain." "Needed supplies," Jedediah said, his tone flat. Barrett's gaze dropped to the package of quinine and the bolt of flannel. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Is that so? Somebody feeling poorly up at your place?" "Cough," Jedediah lied. "Settled in my chest." "A cough that needs flannel, eh?" Barrett laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Heard you might have had some visitors, Stone. Folks get lost in the snow sometimes. Find the nearest shelter." "Haven't seen anyone," Jedediah said, meeting the foreman's gaze. His own was as cold and hard as river ice. Barrett held his stare for a long moment, searching for a crack, a flicker of fear. He found none. Jedediah Stone had a reputation that preceded him. He wasn't a man who started trouble, but tales lingered from his past, whispers of a time before he came to the mountains, a time when the pistol on his hip wasn't just for show. Finally, Barrett straightened up, the smile dropping from his face. "Well, if you do, there's a reward. For my property." He let the word hang in the air, thick and ugly. He turned and walked back to the stove, but the threat lingered. Jedediah paid Henderson, the silver coins clicking loudly in the tense silence. He gathered his supplies and walked out, the eyes of every man in the store following him. He didn't look back. The trek home was fueled by a cold anger. Barrett hadn't just been asking questions, he had been marking his territory, turning the community's suspicion into a weapon. Jedediah was no longer just a recluse, he was now a man with a secret, a man who had defied a powerful figure. He arrived back at the cabin well after dark, guided by the faint yellow light in the window. He saw the bar was still across the door. He knocked, a specific rhythm they had not discussed, but that felt right. After a moment, the bar was lifted, and the door creaked open. Mai stood there, the rifle held awkwardly but firmly in her hands. She lowered it when she saw him, relief washing over her face. He stepped inside, setting the supplies on the table. The cabin was warm, and the air smelled of pine smoke and something else, a faint herbal scent. Anne was still on the cot, but her breathing seemed less ragged. He looked at Mai, who was already unwrapping the quinine. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that Barrett would come. He had seen the possessive gleam in the foreman's eyes. This wasn't about 2 runaway workers anymore. It was about power. And Jedediah had just publicly challenged it. The blizzard had ended, but the real storm was just about to break. The quinine worked its slow, bitter magic. Over the next few days, Anne's fever receded, leaving her weak and hollow-eyed, but alive. The color returned to her cheeks, and she was able to sit up, propped against the cabin wall, sipping the broth I carefully fed her. With the immediate crisis past, a new kind of tension settled in the cabin. It was the tension of waiting. Jedediah kept his pistol cleaned and oiled on the table, a silent sentinel. He spent his days chopping wood, creating a formidable pile that was as much a fortification of his resolve as it was fuel for the fire. One evening, as Jedediah sat sharpening a knife by the hearth, Mai approached him. She had been quiet and watchful since his trip to town, sensing the new danger that clung to him. She held out a small, folded piece of oilcloth. "He will come," she said, her English improving with each passing day. "The man from the camp." "Barrett." Jedediah nodded, not looking up from his work. "I know. He is a bad man," she continued, her voice low and intense. "He lies." She carefully unfolded the oilcloth, revealing a single sheet of paper inside. It was a legal document, covered in elegant script that was foreign to her. She handed it to Jedediah. It was a land deed, properly filed with the territorial office in Helena. It granted 160 acres of land under the Homestead Act to a man named Lee Wei, her father. The claim was for a plot of land bordering a place called Jade Creek, not 20 miles from where they now Saturday. "Our father," Mai explained, her words coming in a quiet rush. "He worked for the railroad. He saved his money. He bought this land for us. He sent for us to come from our home, to build a life here. He wrote us letters." She paused, her throat tight. "He died. A rockfall in the tunnel. Before we arrived." Jedediah looked up from the deed, his knife forgotten in his hand. The story began to piece itself together. "When we arrived," Mai went on, "Barrett met us. He said our father owed him a great debt. He said we had to work to pay it. He had papers. Contracts. He took our father's things." She looked at her sister, sleeping peacefully for the first time in over a week. "We did not know. We worked. In the kitchen, the laundry. But Barrett, he wanted more. We found this deed. It was hidden in the lining of our father's old coat. We knew he had lied. So we ran." Jedediah stared at the paper in his hand. It was their hope, their legacy, and the reason they were being hunted. Barrett hadn't just intercepted 2 workers, he had stolen their future. He was not just a bully, but a thief who preyed on those who couldn't fight back, who didn't even know the language of the laws that were supposed to protect them. A cold, familiar anger settled in Jedediah's gut. It was the kind of anger he had come to the mountains to bury, the kind that had once led him to a life he was trying to forget. He folded the deed carefully and handed it back to Mai. "Keep this safe," he said. "It's all that matters." 3 days later, they came. Jedediah saw them from the window, 3 riders cresting the hill against the bright morning snow. Barrett was in the lead, flanked by the same 2 men from the general store. They weren't coming to talk. They rode with the unhurried confidence of predators who have cornered their prey. Jedediah turned to Mai. "Take your sister. Go into the root cellar. Bar it from the inside. Do not come out until I tell you." Mai's eyes were wide with terror, but she didn't argue. She helped her weak but determined to her feet and guided her to the trapdoor in the floor, disappearing into the darkness below. Jedediah heard the heavy beam slide into place. He took his pistol from the table, checked the load, and slid it into the worn holster on his hip. He didn't take the rifle. This was not a battle to be fought from a distance. He stepped out onto the small porch, pulling the cabin door shut behind him. He stood there, waiting, his hands loose at his sides. Barrett and his men reined in their horses a few yards away. The animals stamped and blew clouds of steam in the frigid air. "Stone," Barrett called out, his voice smug. "We've come for my property. No trouble, now. Just send out the girls, and we'll be on our way." "They're not your property," Jedediah said, his voice calm and even. It carried easily in the still, cold air. "And they're not going anywhere." Barrett's face darkened. "I have contracts, Stone. Signed and legal. The law is on my side." "The contracts are fraudulent," Jedediah stated, not as an argument, but as a fact. "Their father owned land. A homestead claim. You stole it." A flicker of surprise, then rage, crossed Barrett's face. He hadn't expected them to know about the deed, or for this quiet mountain man to have pieced it together. "You're a fool," Barrett snarled. "That piece of paper is worthless. My contracts will stand up in any court." He gestured to one of his men. "Go get them." The man dismounted, a length of rope in his hand. He started toward the cabin, a sneer on his face. Jedediah didn't move. He simply watched the man approach. "I'd advise against that," Jedediah said, his voice dropping an octave. The man hesitated, glancing back at Barrett. Barrett nodded, a sharp, angry jerk of his head. "He's one man. Get the girls." The man took another step. Jedediah moved. It was not a fast or flashy movement, but a blur of deadly economy. One moment his hand was at his side, the next, his pistol was drawn, cocked, and leveled at the man's chest. The click of the hammer was unnaturally loud in the silence. The man froze, his eyes wide. Barrett and the other rider tensed, their hands moving toward their own weapons. "Don't," Jedediah said, his gaze not leaving the man in front of him, but his voice encompassing them all. "This is your only warning. You came here to threaten helpless women and steal what isn't yours. That ends now. Get on your horses. Ride away. Don't come back." There was a terrible stillness to him. It wasn't the bluster of a common brawler. It was the lethal calm of a man who knew exactly what the gun in his hand could do, and who had made his peace with it long ago. Barrett saw it then. He wasn't dealing with a simple homesteader. He was facing a ghost from the violent past of the territories, a man who had tried to bury his history under the snow and silence. Barrett was a bully, and bullies only function when their victims are afraid. Jedediah was not afraid. He was something far more dangerous. He was resolved. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The only sound was the wind whispering through the pines. Finally, Barrett broke the silence. "This isn't over, Stone," he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "I'll get the marshal. We'll see what the law says about a thief and a squatter harboring my runaways." "You do that," Jedediah said softly. Barrett yanked on his reins, turning his horse so sharply it reared. He and his men galloped away, their retreat as loud and chaotic as their arrival had been arrogant. Jedediah stood on the porch, pistol still in hand, until they were out of sight. He didn't lower the weapon until their hoofbeats had faded completely into the vast silence of the mountains. Only then did he feel the tremor in his own hand. He had made a choice. He had stepped out of the shadows and back into the world, trading his solitude for a fight that was not his own. He knew Barrett would make good on his threat. The law, in its clumsy, blind way, often favored the man with the signed paper, no matter how it was gotten. He had won the confrontation, but he may have just lost the war. Spring arrived late, a slow, grudging thaw that turned the landscape to mud and filled the air with the scent of damp earth and pine. 3 months had passed since the standoff with Barrett. Jedediah had not waited for the marshal to come to him. The day after the confrontation, he had packed a little bag, entrusted the cabin to Mayana recovering and ridden the long trail to Helena. He found an old acquaintance, a lawyer who owed him a debt from a lifetime ago, a man who understood that the law was a tool that could be wielded for good or for ill. The lawyer, a sharp man named Peterson, listened to the story and examined the deed. He recognized Barrett's name. The foreman had a reputation for exploiting immigrant labor, but no one had ever had the proof or the courage to challenge him. The deed was the key. Peterson filed it properly and sent a telegraph to a contact at the Department of the Interior. An inquiry was opened. When the territorial marshal finally did ride out, it was not to Jedediah's cabin, but to the railroad camp. Faced with a federal investigation and the testimony of several other workers who came forward, Barrett's web of deceit unraveled. His contracts were declared void. He fled the territory before he could be arrested, a disgraced man with nothing but the clothes on his back. Now, the sun warmed Jedediah's shoulders as he drove a nail into a roof beam. He was not at his old cabin, but 20 miles south, at Jade Creek. Before him stood the frame of a new, larger cabin, nestled in a small valley fed by a clear, rushing stream. The air was clean, the soil was dark and rich. It was the land from the deed. Anne, her strength fully returned, was on her knees in a patch of newly tilled earth, carefully planting seeds from a small cloth bag. Mai was nearby, hauling water from the creek, her steps strong and sure. They worked together in a comfortable, practiced silence. A new life was being raised from this soil, board by board, seed by seed. The people of Granite Creek, having heard the full story, now treated Jedediah with a new kind of respect. They had seen him not as a recluse to be feared, but as a protector to be admired. Henderson, the store owner, had extended him a line of credit, an unheard-of gesture of trust. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Mai would practice her English by reading aloud from a primer Jedediah had bought. Anne, who had a quiet, artistic spirit, would sketch the wildflowers that were beginning to bloom on the hillsides. They had become a family, forged not by blood, but by a blizzard and a shared act of defiance. That night, after the sisters had gone to their beds in the half-finished cabin, Jedediah sat on the porch steps, watching the stars emerge in the vast, dark sky. He thought of the man he had been, a man running from his own shadow, seeking an emptiness to match the one inside him. He had come to the mountains to be alone, to pare his life down to nothing. Instead, he had found everything. He had learned that a man's character isn't measured by the ghosts he outruns, but by the shelter he builds for others. A life wasn't about the silence you could find, but about the voices you chose to answer. He looked at the sturdy frame of the new house, a dark shape against the stars, a testament not to what he had escaped, but to what he had chosen to build. And for the first time in a very long time, Jedediah Stone felt like he was finally home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.